In the archives of war, silence often screams louder than the recorded word. Entire sections of World War II history remain veiled, not by accident, but by design, tucked away in locked vaults, burned in midnight furnaces, or stamped with seals marked top secret, do not release. What survives are fragments, a shredded telegram from the NKVD, a blurred photograph of an unmarked transport truck in the snow, a misplaced page from a Gestapo registry, a memo half erased by time and deliberate omission. For decades, these fragments surfaced like bones rising from the soil, hinting at truths so unsettling that governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain fought to bury them again. And yet, the past resists silence. It pushes back through whispers from survivors, through hidden files smuggled across borders, through diaries that surface in dusty attics, through sealed reports declassified long after their authors have vanished into the ground. This is not the familiar story of battles and generals, flags raised and treaties signed. This is the story of the shadows, covert pacts, vanishing divisions, betrayals staged under the mask of strategy, and atrocities hidden behind the thin veil of diplomacy. What you are about to hear are not myths or conspiracies. They are the suppressed truths of World War II, excavated from long-forgotten files and spoken aloud after decades of official silence. Truths that prove the greatest war of the 20th century was darker, colder, and far more secret than the world was ever meant to know. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Pact of Lviv Shadows. The city of Lviv in 1941 was no stranger to occupation, brutality, and betrayal. Its cobblestone streets had already witnessed the collapse of the Polish Republic, the swift occupation by the Soviet NKVD, and then the sudden arrival of German forces under Operation Barbarossa. Yet hidden beneath the chaos of troop movements and artillery fire was a pact so sinister it remained buried for decades. Soviet archives labeled the arrangement as File 927 Black Lantern, a code name chosen for its implication of light extinguished in secrecy. According to surviving documents, NKVD officers retreating east and Gestapo operatives advancing west convened in a commandeered administrative building near Lviv's Rynok Square. The meeting, brief and unsanctioned by higher command, produced an agreement of cold efficiency, an exchange of prisoner lists, cross-referenced names of dissidents, intellectuals, priests, and underground resistance leaders. These men and women, targeted by both regimes, were marked for immediate elimination. It was not an alliance of ideology, but of necessity, each side unwilling to tolerate independent movements beyond their control. The air in Lviv during those days was thick with the smell of burning records and abandoned food stores, the remnants of Soviet forces withdrawing in haste. NKVD trucks, painted in the muted grey-green of Soviet transport, carried boxes of dossiers that were too sensitive to destroy on sight. Survivors recalled seeing Gestapo agents arrive in plain uniforms, their black boots caked with the mud of the frontier, carrying only briefcases and revolvers. The transaction was simple: information in exchange for blood. Soviet files marked Kurtz indicated the presence of a German liaison officer who signed off on the transfer of intelligence, while the NKVD's Colonel Mikhail Sokolov allegedly provided corresponding Soviet dossiers. Witnesses later described men from both sides shaking hands in silence, their pact unrecorded in official communique, but immortalized in the bodies that soon filled Lviv's prisons and courtyards. Within days, roundups began. Families were torn from their apartments at dawn, their names shouted from lists carried by men speaking both German and Russian. Priests, teachers, and known members of the Polish Home Army disappeared into the dungeons of Brygidki prison, only to be found later in shallow graves. The sudden precision of the arrests shocked the local population. This was not random occupation violence, but systematic extermination built on intelligence too detailed to be coincidence. The streets of Lviv bore witness to what can only be described as a bureaucratic massacre, administrative genocide orchestrated. Through shared files and stamped pages, evidence of this pact might have vanished completely, had it not been for fragments discovered decades later. In 1983, Polish dissidents attempted to smuggle documents across the Iron Curtain, including correspondence bearing the codename Kurtz. The letter, though incomplete, referenced coordinated actions in Lviv, a chilling euphemism that fit too neatly with survivor testimonies. Additional Soviet memoranda, released after the collapse of the USSR, confirmed NKVD involvement in prisoner transfers at the exact time Gestapo records show a spike in arrests. These intersecting data points formed a paper trail that historians could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The significance of this forgotten pact cannot be overstated. It revealed that in the grey zones of war, ideological enemies were capable of temporary cooperation when it served their goals of control. For the NKVD, the pact ensured that anti-Soviet elements would never regroup under German occupation. For the Gestapo, it provided a ready-made map of Poland's underground leaders, accelerating the destruction of resistance networks. For the people of Lviv, it meant betrayal from both directions, with no refuge in faith, politics, or nationality. Their city became the stage for a dark experiment in mutual extermination, an experiment carried out with signatures, seals, and handshakes conducted in the shadows. Decades of silence followed. Official Soviet history blamed German atrocities exclusively, erasing all references to NKVD cooperation. German records, fragmented by deliberate destruction in the final days of the war, reduced the event to security measures against partisans. Survivors who spoke out were silenced by censorship, imprisonment, or exile. The memory of the pact lived only in whispered testimonies, passed down in families like a curse. Not until the late 20th century did the pieces begin to resurface, when historians pried open vaults in Kiev, Moscow, and Warsaw. There, among mold-stained files and broken seals, lay the evidence, incomplete but undeniable. Names, dates, and signatures that tied two mortal enemies together in a conspiracy of slaughter. Even now, many questions remain unanswered. Who authorized the pact, if anyone, beyond the local officers in Lviv? Was it an isolated incident, or part of a wider network of shadow agreements between German and Soviet intelligence? How many other lists were exchanged? How many names doomed not by ideology, but by paperwork? The answers remain obscured by missing files, destroyed archives, and deliberate erasure. But what is known is chilling enough. Lviv in 1941 was not merely a city caught between two armies. It was the burial ground of a secret collaboration, a place where ideology was briefly set aside in favor of efficiency, and where lives were traded like currency in the war's darkest marketplace. This is the shadow history of Lviv, a forgotten pact of silence, betrayal, and shared blood, a truth the victors on both sides sought to erase, but which survives in fragments, waiting for voices willing to read them aloud. Chapter 2: Operation Iron Wolf and Vanished Divisions. Among the most enduring mysteries of the Eastern Front is the story of entire German units that simply vanished from the record. Official Wehrmacht reports list them as annihilated in battle, swallowed by Soviet offensives in the bitter winter of 1944. Yet declassified files from Munich's underground military archives, opened in the late 1990s, tell a far darker tale. The documents reveal the existence of Operation Eisenwolf, Iron Wolf, an operation conceived not for victory, but for disappearance. The plan involved redeploying divisions into eastern Poland, stripping them of insignia and identity, and erasing their existence from both German and Soviet records. What followed was the transformation of thousands of soldiers into a phantom army, their movements hidden beneath layers of deliberate deception and official silence. The origins of Eisenwolf can be traced to January 1944, as the Soviet Second Belarusian Front advanced westward through Byelorussia. German High Command, already reeling from losses at Stalingrad and Kursk, recognized that certain divisions faced inevitable destruction. Rather than allow these men to fall into Soviet hands or appear as casualties in statistics that would demoralize the Reich, orders were issued under SS authority to reconstitute select units in secrecy. According to surviving fragments of Wehrmacht dispatches, Division 389 and elements of the 252nd Infantry Regiment were listed as destroyed in combat, even as surviving soldiers were quietly reassigned into new formations with no official designations. The codename Eisenwolf appeared repeatedly in encrypted messages between Army Group Center and SS Command in Krakow, always attached to language describing reallocation beyond record. For civilians caught in the path of these phantom units, their existence was all too real. Villagers across the Vistula corridor recounted encounters with German troops who bore no insignia on their tunics, who spoke in hushed tones and carried weapons with filed-down serial numbers. These men conducted raids not against organized armies, but against unarmed settlements. Entire hamlets were burned without explanation, their populations scattered or executed, leaving only smoldering ruins behind. Survivors told of hearing fragmented dialects, Saxon, Bavarian, Sudeten German, spoken in half-suppressed whispers, suggesting the units were cobbled together from remnants of shattered divisions. To those who survived, they seemed less like soldiers of the Reich than ghosts wearing stolen uniforms, carrying out orders no one would admit existed. Soviet intelligence took Eisenwolf seriously. Reports recovered from Moscow's military archives describe Red Army patrols engaging enemy troops in areas where German high command had officially recorded no presence. One particularly chilling dispatch from March 1944 details an encounter near the village of Baranow, where Soviet scouts stumbled upon a company-sized force that ambushed them with extraordinary precision. Prisoners captured in the skirmish refused to identify their unit, insisting they were dead already. NKVD officers noted the psychological effect of these phantom battalions, labeling them regiments of the fallen. Their presence sowed confusion in Soviet ranks, where commanders struggled to reconcile their intelligence with German records that claimed these divisions no longer existed. Western intelligence agencies were aware of the phenomenon, but chose silence. Declassified OSS documents reveal analysts in London and Washington dismissed Eisenwolf reports as Soviet exaggerations designed to magnify German resilience. The official narrative in Allied publications insisted these vanished divisions had been obliterated in the fields of eastern Poland. Yet buried in the annexes of those same files are memos acknowledging intercepted German radio traffic that hinted at restructured units operating beyond formal rosters. The choice to dismiss these signals was deliberate, aimed at avoiding unnecessary complications in post-war negotiations. The war ended, Berlin fell, and the phantom regiments should have disappeared with it. But rumors persisted into the Cold War. In 1952, a Soviet memorandum warned of former Eisenwolf elements resurfacing as part of clandestine NATO stay-behind networks. These covert cells, later revealed in the scandal of Operation Gladio, were designed to resist Soviet occupation in Western Europe. According to the Soviet report, fragments of the vanished German units had been reconstituted in secret, recruited for their proven ability to operate without official recognition, to exist in the shadows of history itself. Whether this was paranoia or truth remains unresolved, but the possibility casts a dark shadow over post-war intelligence politics. For decades, historians treated Operation Eisenwolf as rumor, an invention of Soviet propaganda, or the fevered imagination of survivors haunted by war. But in the late 1990s, the opening of Munich's vaults provided hard evidence. Carbon copies of dispatches, marked with the seals of Army Group Center, carried instructions for complete record elimination of specific units. Accompanying notes from SS Command confirmed the reassignment of personnel under new codenames, their fates to remain outside official reporting. One chilling line, underlined in red pencil, reads, "History must show them as ashes." The handwriting belonged to SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, the architect of several secret projects in the war's final years. The question that lingers is not only what became of these soldiers, but why their existence was buried so deliberately. Was Eisenwolf merely an attempt to salvage manpower for irregular operations? Or did it serve as the foundation for post-war clandestine armies operating across Europe? Testimonies from captured Eisenwolf veterans complicate the answer. In Soviet interrogations, several prisoners claimed they were told explicitly, "You do not exist. You have already died in the field. Your task is to live as shadows." These words suggest an indoctrination designed not for short-term survival, but for permanent anonymity, a psychological erasure that bound men to missions no historian could trace. The Phantom. Divisions of Eisenwolf remain one of the most disturbing footnotes of World War II. They remind us that war is not only fought on open battlefields, but in the manipulation of memory, the crafting of records, and the deliberate silencing of truths. Thousands of men, erased from the official rosters of both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, linger in a twilight zone of history, neither alive nor dead, acknowledged nor forgotten. They became ghosts in uniform, vanishing into forests, villages, and perhaps into the clandestine networks of the Cold War that followed. Operation Iron Wolf was not just a military maneuver, it was a calculated disappearance, a transformation of soldiers into shadows that history was never meant to record. Chapter 3. Churchill's Silent Deal over Warsaw Uprising. In August 1944, the Polish capital erupted in defiance. The Warsaw Uprising, launched by the Polish Home Army under Operation Tempest, was a desperate attempt to liberate the city before the Red Army's arrival. For 63 harrowing days, men, women, and children fought against German armor with homemade grenades, captured rifles, and sheer resolve. They believed aid from their British and American allies would arrive, dropping weapons, food, and reinforcements from the skies. But the aid never came, or when it did, it was meager, scattered, and too late. Hidden in the British National Archives under file HS9-2147 lies the reason why. A decision made in smoke-filled rooms of Whitehall, a pact sealed in silence with Moscow, and a choice that condemned Warsaw to burn. The uprising began on August 1st, 1944. Radio broadcasts crackled with Polish voices declaring freedom in defiance of the Reich. Within days, the Germans unleashed devastating reprisals. SS Dirlewanger units, infamous for their brutality, swept through districts with flamethrowers and machine guns. Civilians were massacred by the thousands, entire neighborhoods leveled. Yet the Home Army still held key strongpoints and awaited Allied air support. Requests were transmitted to London, encrypted pleas for assistance. What they received was delay after delay. Winston Churchill's cabinet debated not logistics, but politics. Stalin, whose armies sat idle across the Vistula, refused to allow Allied aircraft to land on Soviet-controlled airfields. He declared the uprising a reckless adventure and privately referred to it as a nuisance to Soviet plans for post-war dominance. The Home Army, fiercely loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, represented a political threat to Stalin's vision of a Soviet-controlled Poland. And in the cold calculus of war, London chose not to challenge him. Internal telegrams between Whitehall and Cairo Command reveal the language of betrayal. Orders carried the coded phrase, strategic silence, an instruction to mask deliberate inaction as unavoidable circumstance. The SOE, Britain's Special Operations Executive, filed reports acknowledging the Poles' dire situation. Yet their recommendations for immediate intervention were suppressed. British bombers flew missions over Europe daily, but requests to divert to Warsaw were rejected, citing lack of viable bases. The truth was more damning. Bases existed, but permission from Moscow was withheld, and Churchill's government quietly accepted Stalin's veto. Allied drops that did occur originated from distant Italy, forcing bombers to travel over 1,600 miles, often losing payloads to inaccuracy or enemy fire. Of thousands of supply containers, only a fraction reached the Polish fighters, the rest falling into German hands or shattering uselessly on city streets. Meanwhile, the Germans pressed their extermination campaign. Intercepted Enigma communications, later catalogued as Series 5 in Bletchley Park archives, confirmed orders for total liquidation of the uprising. Civilians were executed en masse, hospitals bombed, and captured resistance fighters shot on sight. Reports describe the systematic destruction of Warsaw, block by block, until 90% of the city lay in ruins. The Home Army's radio operators continued to send frantic appeals to London. Messages recorded in the archives with chilling brevity. "We are being massacred. The world is silent." The world, indeed, had chosen silence as policy. When pressed in later years, Churchill defended his decisions, citing logistical impossibility and the overwhelming power of Soviet refusal. Yet documents discovered decades later suggest otherwise. Cabinet notes show discussions of political trade-offs. London sought to maintain fragile cooperation with Moscow to ensure post-war agreements at Yalta and Tehran. Sacrificing the Warsaw Uprising, tragic as it was, became an acceptable cost in this brutal arithmetic. By refusing to challenge Stalin, the British government effectively abandoned its Polish allies, allowing the Soviet Union to emerge as the sole power in Eastern Europe. The uprising's failure cleared the path for Stalin's installation of a puppet regime in Warsaw, erasing the influence of the legitimate government in exile. The consequences were catastrophic. Nearly 200,000 Poles perished, most of them civilians. The Home Army, once a formidable underground force, was annihilated. Warsaw itself became a skeletal ruin, its cultural heritage obliterated by German explosives. Survivors of the uprising who fell into Soviet hands were often imprisoned, interrogated, or executed, labeled enemies of the state for their loyalty to London. For Poland, the betrayal marked not only the loss of a city, but the loss of its independence, traded away in secret cables between allies who had promised freedom but delivered silence. For decades, the official Western narrative described the tragedy as an unfortunate impossibility, the result of distance and circumstance. It was framed as a heroic but doomed struggle, noble in intent but unsalvageable in practice. Only with the release of classified files did the truth emerge. The failure to aid Warsaw was not inevitable, but deliberate. It was the product of diplomacy, a silent deal with Stalin that ensured Allied cooperation at the expense of Polish lives. Churchill's own notes, preserved in the margins of memoranda, reveal his awareness of the consequences. One scrawled remark in his distinctive hand reads, "Warsaw is beyond saving. The Russians will have it in their time." The Warsaw Uprising remains one of the darkest chapters in Allied history, not for what was done, but for what was not done. It was a silence weaponized, a betrayal signed not with ink on treaties, but with absence in the skies above a burning city. For those who fought and died in Warsaw, the silence was louder than any bomb. For history, it stands as proof that even in a war against tyranny, politics could dictate betrayal, and allies could decide that some cries for help were never meant to be answered. Chapter 4. Japan's Unit 731. Western Cover-Up. At the edge of Harbin, in occupied Manchuria, the sprawling complex of Unit 731 stood disguised as a water purification facility. Behind its gates, however, was a nightmare factory. Overseen by General Shiro Ishii, this secret Japanese unit conducted experiments so grotesque that even Nazi doctors in Dachau paled in comparison. Prisoners of war, Chinese civilians, Mongolian peasants, and even captured Allied soldiers were subjected to vivisections without anesthesia, deliberate infection with plague, anthrax, and cholera, and exposure to freezing conditions to study the limits of human endurance. The atrocities carried out under the banner of biological warfare research were meticulously documented, each experiment coded, logged, and sealed into files meant for the eyes of Japan's military elite. At war's end, the world might have expected swift justice. Instead, the full horror of Unit 731 was buried, not by Tokyo, but by Washington. Declassified papers marked Project Xeno Harvest, discovered in US Army intelligence files, confirm a calculated bargain. In exchange for exclusive access to Unit 731's data, General Ishii and his subordinates were granted full immunity from prosecution. American officials, desperate for an advantage in biological warfare at the dawn of the Cold War, concluded that the gruesome fruits of Ishii's experiments were too valuable to destroy. Orders from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo instructed tribunals to omit references to Unit 731 in their indictments, framing Japanese atrocities as limited to conventional war crimes. By 1947, Ishii was living comfortably, reportedly consulting US Army researchers, while hundreds of his former staff re-entered civilian life unpunished. The victims, meanwhile, were reduced to statistics buried in locked filing cabinets. The Soviets tried to expose the truth. In 1949, the Khabarovsk trials presented detailed testimonies from captured Unit 731 officers, outlining human experimentation on an industrial scale. Witnesses described plague bombs tested on entire Chinese villages, frostbite experiments where prisoners' limbs were struck with wooden bats until flesh shattered like ice, and dissections performed on conscious subjects. Soviet prosecutors provided meticulous detail, dates, names, laboratory procedures. Yet their evidence was dismissed in the West as propaganda. American officials publicly ridiculed the trials, insisting the Soviets had fabricated testimony to slander Japan and the United States. Privately, however, Fort Detrick in Maryland was already incorporating Ishii's files into its biological warfare program. Survivor testimonies smuggled out of Manchuria in the 1960s confirmed the horror. Families recalled black trucks arriving in villages at night, rounding up men, women, and children who never returned. Others spoke of rivers running with the carcasses of plague-infected animals dumped upstream by Japanese soldiers. These stories were ignored by mainstream narratives, overshadowed by Cold War alliances. Washington, unwilling to expose its complicity, ensured the subject of Unit 731 remained absent from history textbooks, tribunals, and international debates. For decades, even in Japan, open discussion of the unit was suppressed, its former members shielded by silence and political convenience. The cover-up extended deep into American institutions. Project Xeno Harvest files detail how Ishii's frostbite research influenced US studies into hypothermia treatment for soldiers, stationed in Korea. His plague weaponization data fed into contingency planning during the Korean War, when fears of Soviet biological warfare ran high. Even NASA reportedly received consultations from former Unit 731 scientists, whose work on human endurance at extreme altitudes proved useful for the space race. In this way, the knowledge gained through unimaginable cruelty was recycled into programs presented as scientific progress, with little acknowledgement of the dead who paid for it. The moral corruption of this bargain is staggering. By granting immunity to war criminals, the United States institutionalized their crimes. Justice was sacrificed on the altar of national security, and truth was traded for tactical advantage. In Tokyo, the Tokyo Tribunal's official records made no mention of Unit 731, as though its thousands of victims had never existed. In Washington, documents were stamped classified and locked away, with entire sections redacted under black ink. It was not until decades later, when fragments were declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, that researchers pieced together the scope of the cover-up. Even then, key files remain missing, suggesting deliberate destruction. What makes Unit 731's story most disturbing is not only the scale of the atrocities, but the silence that followed. Unlike the Nuremberg doctors' trial, where Nazi physicians faced judgment, Ishii and his staff lived out their lives in peace. Some entered academia, becoming professors in Japanese universities. Others joined pharmaceutical companies, applying their knowledge to the booming post-war industry. They walked freely among the very population their experiments had devastated, shielded by American secrecy. For the victims, whose voices were silenced in mass graves, the absence of justice was a second death, one inflicted by those who claimed to fight for freedom and human dignity. The legacy of Unit 731 haunts international law. It exposed the fragility of justice when confronted with geopolitical interests. It proved that even the most horrific crimes could be erased from history if their perpetrators proved useful to the victors. The Soviet Union's warnings, dismissed at the time as propaganda, now read as grimly accurate accounts of truth the West refused to face. Harbin's ruins, where the compound once stood, remain a scar on the landscape. But the deeper scar lies in the deliberate forgetting, orchestrated by those who chose secrecy over accountability. The story of Unit 731 is not merely one of Japanese war crimes. It is a story of global complicity, of Western powers who embrace the fruits of atrocity while silencing the victims. It is a reminder that history can be engineered, truths withheld, and justice postponed indefinitely. For decades, the victims of Harbin remained faceless numbers in suppressed reports. Only now, as the documents resurface and survivor testimonies are heard, does the world begin to grasp the enormity of what was hidden. And yet, the full archive remains incomplete, raising the chilling possibility that the worst truths of Unit 731 remain buried still, waiting to surface in some forgotten vault marked Top Secret Do Not Release. The war's hidden corridors do not end with battles fought, cities burned, or treaties signed. They stretch forward, threading into the present, leaving unresolved questions that still hang in the silence of locked archives. In Lviv, the forgotten pact between NKVD and Gestapo forces reminds us that sworn enemies can clasp hands when power demands it. In the forests of eastern Poland, Operation Iron Wolf leaves the unsettling spectre of divisions erased from record but not from memory, phantom soldiers whose fate remains unwritten. In Warsaw, the silence of Allied skies exposes a betrayal not by enemy fire, but by the deliberate absence of promised allies. And in Harbin, Unit 731's horrors prove that victory does not always bring justice, but sometimes substitutes secrecy for truth. These stories, once dismissed as rumor or propaganda, surface now through fragments, files marked classified, testimonies whispered in exile, signatures buried in the margins of forgotten memos. They form a shadow history, one stitched together not by triumph but by omission, suppression, and calculated silence. The Second World War, long believed to be the most documented conflict in human history, still conceals dark corners that shift our understanding of its cost. Perhaps the greatest question that remains is not what happened, but what else was buried, what other truths still lie hidden in sealed vaults, waiting to rise like ghosts through the cracks of time. And if these truths resurface, will the world finally listen, or will silence once again swallow their voices?